The Second Battle of Artois from 9 May to 18 June 1915 was a battle on the Western Front during the First World War. A German-held salient from Reims to Amiens had been formed in 1914, which menaced communications between Paris and northern France. A reciprocal French advance eastwards in Artois could cut the rail lines supplying the German armies between Arras and Reims. French operations in Artois, Champagne and Alsace from November–December 1914 led General Joseph Joffre, Generalissimo and head of Grand Quartier General, to continue the offensive in Champagne against the German southern rail supply route and to plan an offensive in Artois, against the lines supplying the German armies from the north. Field Marshal Sir John French, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, cooperated with the French strategy to capture Vimy Ridge, by planning British attacks against Aubers Ridge, to confront the German Sixth Army with a joint offensive on a 70 miles front, ready to exploit eastwards into the Douai Plain, where an advance of 10 to 15 miles would cut the railways supplying the German armies as far south as Reims. The French attacked Vimy Ridge and the British attacked further north in the Battle of Aubers Ridge and the Battle of Festubert. The battle was fought during the German offensive of the Second Battle of Ypres, which the Germans ended to reinforce the Artois front. The initial French attack broke through and captured Vimy Ridge, but reserve units were not able to reinforce the troops on the ridge. Before German counter-attacks forced them back about halfway to their jumping-off points. The British attack at Aubers Ridge was a costly failure and 2 German divisions in reserve were diverted south against the 10th Army. The British offensive was suspended until the 15th of May, when the Battle of Festubert began, and French attacks from the 15th of May to 15th of June was concentrated on the flanks, to create jumping-off points for a second general offensive, which began on the 16th of June. The British attacks at Festubert forced the Germans back 3 kilometers and diverted reserves from the French, but the French gained little more ground, despite firing double the amount of artillery ammunition, at the cost of many casualties to both sides. On the 18th of June, the main offensive was stopped and local attacks were ended on the 25th of June. The French offensive had advanced the front line about 3 kilometers towards Vimy Ridge, on an 8-kilometer front. The failure to break through, despite the expenditure of 2,155,862 shells and the loss of 102,500 casualties, led to recriminations against Joffre. The German Sixth Army lost 73,072 casualties. A lull followed until the Second Battle of Champagne, the Third Battle of Artois and the Battle of Loos in September. Background: strategic developments. French offensives in Artois, Champagne, and Saint-Mihiel, after the Marne campaign in 1914, had been costly failures and led to criticism of the leadership of General Joseph Joffre within the army and the French government. The President, Raymond Poincaré, arranged several meetings between Joffre and the Council of Ministers in March and April 1915, where reports of the failed operations were debated, particularly a condemnation of the April offensive against the Saint-Mihiel salient. Joffre retained undivided command and freedom to conduct operations as he saw fit, which had been given at the beginning of the war, but was instructed to consult with his subordinates. Provisional army groups, which had been established in late 1914, were made permanent soon afterwards. The French government accepted that the task facing Joffre and the army was far more difficult than expected after the winter fighting in Artois and Champagne. Despite costly mistakes, many lessons had been learned, methods had been changed and more weapons and equipment necessary for siege warfare had been delivered. The offensives had failed in their objectives but had become more powerful and better organized, except for the bungle at Saint-Mihiel. The greater amount of heavy artillery for offensive operations gave grounds for confidence that further attacks could break the German front and liberate France. In late 1914, General Erich von Falkenhayn, chief of the General Staff of the German Army Oberste Heeresleitung since 14 September, had reinforced the Fourth Army and attacked westwards, parallel to the North Sea coast, culminating in the Battle of the Yser and the First Battle of Ypres, when open warfare in the West ended. 8 new divisions were formed in February 1915 and another 14 in April, which were formed into an 11th Army, intended for an offensive in France. Despite the French offensive in Champagne in February, Falkenhayn was forced to cancel his plans to attack in the west and sent the 11th Army to the Eastern Front, to support the Austro-Hungarian Army, which has lost more than 2 million casualties by March 1915. 9 divisions were transferred to Russia in May, which reduced the West here to 97 divisions against 110 to 112 larger French, British and Belgian divisions. The Western armies had c. 4,000 modern and 350 obsolete field guns, 825 modern and 510 obsolete heavy guns and 10 super-heavy howitzers. A reserve of 276 heavy guns and mortars was also being prepared. The OL had 7.5 divisions in reserve, with the 58th and 115th Divisions behind the 6th Army. Indications of an attack in Artois had been detected, but not signs of a general offensive on the Western Front. The West here was forced to remain on the defensive, except for limited attacks in Flanders in the Second Battle of Ypres and in the Argonne west of Verdun until August, to cut the main rail line from Paris to Verdun. In memoranda issued on 7 and 25 January 1915, Falkenhayn ordered that the existing positions of the German armies in France were to be fortified, so that they could resist attacks with only small forces, to enable reserves to be sent to Russia. Should part of the front line be lost, it was to be retaken by counterattack. Behind the line, new defences were to be built and connected by communication trenches, to delay a further attack, until reserves could be assembled for a counterattack. Enemy reinforcements were to be obstructed by a shell barrage. On 4 May, Falkenhayn reiterated the need to improve reserve positions and also to build a rear position about 2 to 3 kilometers behind the front line. During 1915, the German armies on the Western Front increased the front line from 1 to 3 trenches, built a second trench system 1,500–3,000 yards behind the front line, and developed the defensive use of machine guns and artillery to restrict an attack to a bend in the line. The Franco-British offensives in 1915 found the German defences in a state of continuous development, as the building program was completed slowly, due to a shortage of labour. Tactical developments in March 1915. Joffre concluded that a period of inactivity would benefit the Germans more than the French. General Ferdinand Foch, commander of the Groupe Provisoire du Nord, proposed an offensive in which a general action on the Western Front, including the British, to confuse the defenders and pin down reserves, would complement a decisive action to break through the German defences, at a place where the Germans would not be able to establish a new defensive front by a short retirement. Joffre accepted the proposals on 23 March. With the objective being the seizure of Vimy Ridge and exploitation of the success by an eastwards advance into the Douai Plain. The French army had not completed an adaptation to siege warfare, and much of the equipment necessary, particularly heavy artillery, did not exist. It had been impossible to synchronize operations in Artois with the First Battle of Champagne, which ended on 17 March. Debate within the army as to means and ends had led to two schools of thought. Those who, like Joffre, favored continuous battle, and advocates of methodical battle, like Foch, who wanted to conduct offensives as series of attacks, with pauses to reorganize and consolidate. The theoretical bases of the forthcoming French offensive in Artois were collected in Bataille Conditions d'un Action Offensive d'Ensemble 16 April, 1915, which had been compiled from analyses of reports received from the front since 1914. The document contained instructions on infiltration tactics, rolling, barrages and poison gas, which were to be used systematically for the first time. Although doubtful about the capacity of the British to attack, Joffre wanted an offensive on the northern flank of the 10th Army, to force the Germans to disperse their defences. At a meeting on 29 March, with Sir John French, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force, and Herbert Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, it was agreed that the 9th and 20th Corps would be relieved at Ypres by British units, and on 1 April, French agreed to attack at the same time as the 10th Army. French doubts about the efficiency of the BEF had not diminished after the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, and British doubts about the French had increased after the debacle at Ypres on the 22nd of April. When French troops had been routed by a German gas attack, Joffre had to agree to place reserves behind the Ypres front to secure British cooperation. The size of the German army was increased over the winter, and by reorganizing the existing field army divisions with fewer infantry battalions, the new divisions were given a nucleus of trained and experienced troops. The change to a 9-battalion organization was also intended to make it easier to move divisions from quiet sectors without undue disruption. On 3 March, Falkenhayn formed the 11th Army, intended to be the main attacking army on the Western Front, and on 30 March, its Chief of Staff, Colonel von Seeckt, recommended an offensive between Arras and Albert. The proposal required 14 corps and 150 heavy artillery batteries. A western offensive was cancelled in April, due to the deteriorating situation on the Eastern Front, where the Austro-Hungarian army faced collapse. The 11th Army and other divisions were sent east, and the initiative in the west was left with the Entente armies. The defences of the German army in the west had been improvised since late 1914, and in many places were vulnerable to the growing number of French heavy guns. During the spring, the West here began to implement a standard defensive theory and to build a second position with barbed wire in front, far enough behind the first position to require an attacker to pause to bring field artillery into range. The first position was elaborated into a zone, with camouflaged strongpoints and machine gun nests built of concrete behind the front trenches. The 6th Army held a front of 90 kilometers from Menin to the south of Arras, with 13 divisions and the 58th and 115th Divisions in all reserve. Behind the front, the 6th Army had 660 field guns and 150 heavy guns. West of Lille, the front line was in the marshy Flanders plain, and south of La Bassée, the ground was criss-crossed by waterways and drainage ditches, which made fortification difficult. West of Lens, the high ground of Vimy Ridge and the Lorette Spur dominated the ground further west and to the south around Arras. The ground was overlooked from the ridge at the Loy beyond the Scarpa. Prelude. French offensive preparations since January. French sappers in the Carency area had tunneled 1.5 miles to plant 30 long tons of explosives in galleries under the German positions. The main French front of attack was from the chapel on the plateau of Notre Dame de Lorette Spur south to the Labyrinth, a network covering 2 square miles of trenches, tunnels and dugouts across the Arras-Lens road north of Écurie and Roquelincourt. The spur was the southern boundary of the plain north of the Bethune-La Bassée Canal, which was 6 miles long and wooded in parts, except to the east end. From the north the slopes of the ridge were low, but on the south side there were steep spurs separated by ravines. West of Ablain Street, Nazaire was Spur Mathis, and to the east, the Great Spur, the Arab Spur, the Spur of the White Way, and the Spur of Souchez, which dominated the east edge of Ablain and the sugar refinery between Ablain and Souchez. By the 20th of March the French had worked their way up to the foot of the Great Spur and by the 14th of April had closed up to Ablain. General d'Urbal was appointed to the command of the 10th Army on the 2nd of April, which had 6 infantry corps, a cavalry corps and 3 divisions in reserve. On the right flank was 10th Corps with the 19th and 20th Divisions, the 17th Corps to the left with the 34th and 33rd Divisions, 20th Corps with the 11th and 39th Divisions, 33rd Corps with the Moroccan, 70th and 77th Divisions, 21st Corps with the 13th and 43rd Divisions and 9th Corps with the 92nd Territorial Division and the 17th and 58th Divisions, covering the ground up to the British First Army 15 miles to the north. The 9th Corps and 20th Corps had been relieved by the British in Flanders and moved south from 9 to 16 April, although the 9th Corps headquarters and the 18th, 152nd and 153rd Divisions had to be rushed up to Flanders after the German gas attack at the Second Battle of Ypres. Artillery reinforcements increased the quantity of heavy artillery to 293 guns and field artillery to 1,075 guns. Increased production of ammunition had not kept pace with demand and the French artillery remained short of high explosive shells. Poor quality ammunition also caused a large number of premature detonations in French artillery. French plan of attack: the 10th Army was to attack on a 15-kilometer front, the main attack being made in the center by the 17th, 20th and 33rd Corps on a 10-kilometer front, with supporting attacks along the spur south of Bailleul-Sire-Berthollet by the 21st Corps with 2 divisions along the Notre-Dame-de-Lorette spur. The main attack was to capture Vimy Ridge and then consolidate to prevent German counter-attacks from recapturing the heights. Reserve divisions and cavalry would then begin a pursuit from the ridge into the Douai plain. D'Urbal planned a short bombardment of 4 hours to preserve surprise but was overruled by Foch and Joffre, who imposed a 4-day bombardment. Based on the experience of the failed offensives of the winter and early spring, delays in the arrival of artillery led to a postponement of the attack from the 1st of May until the 7th of May and the bombardment began on the 3rd of May. Bad weather reduced visibility and the bombardment was extended to 6 days and on the 8th of May, the artillery began a destructive bombardment on the German front defenses, which were severely damaged. In the last 4 hours, all of the 10th Army artillery bombarded the German wire and the 1st and reserve trench lines, ready for the infantry attack at 10 a.m. German defensive preparations: the German defenses had been improved in the ridges, hollows and ravines between Arras and Laon, since the War of Movement had ended late in 1914. Barbed wire and chevaux de frise obstacles had been placed in front of the German defenses and tunnels, caves and trenches. Cellars and loophole buildings had been fortified. Avenues of approach were surveyed and registered by the German artillery. The 6th Army had retained most of the plateau of the Lorette Spur and all of the spur of the White Way and Spur Souchet during the local attacks by the French in March and April. On the 9th of May, the French line ran about 1,100 yards west of the chapel, to the summit of the Arab Spur and by the Great Spur and Spur Mathis, down to the valley west of Ablain. 5 German trench lines had been dug from the Arab Spur, across the plateau to the Arras-Bethune road near Aix-Noulette. The trench lines were fortified with iron roofs, sandbags, concrete and barbed wire. At every 100 yards, a machine gun nest had been built into the trench and small fortified posts supported the defenders. One to the northeast of the chapel of Notre-Dame-de-Lorette, with dugouts over 50 feet deep. Artillery and machine guns in Ablain commanded the southern slopes of the ridge and those in Souchet the eastern face of the spur. Guns hidden in Angers and Acute-Vin to the northeast of the plateau commanded the approaches from the plain to the north and along the spur. Below the southern side of the Lorette Spur were Ablain, Souchet and a sugar refinery and buildings along a 200 yards length of the banks of the St. Nazaire stream, which had been fortified. To the south was Mille Malin, and east of the sugar refinery Les Marches. South of Ablain rose wooded heights towards Carency, with the village in a hollow, the houses in 5 groups, one in the center and the others facing north, west, south and east, protected by 4 lines of trenches. Each street and house had been fortified, connected by underground passages and garrisoned with 4 battalions of infantry and 6 companies of engineers. Field guns and machine guns had been dug into the gardens and orchards, as well as behind the church, which made it impossible to attack the village except from the south and east. Trenches connected Carency with Ablain and Souchez on the Bethune-Arras road. Between Souchez and Arras at the hamlet of La Targeta, the Germans had dug trenches, known as the White Works, under which lay a German fortress. To the east of La Targeta was the village of Nerville Street, VAST, 1.5 miles long and 700 yards wide, between the Arras-Bethune and Arras-Lens roads, which had also been turned into an underground fortress. South of Nerville Street, VAST extended the labyrinth, on both sides of the Arras-Lens road, which contained tunnels and small strongpoints organized in a maze, with frequent blank walls and sally ports for the defenders to appear behind the attackers, linked by tunnels to Nerville Street, VAST. About 2 miles east of the labyrinth and Nerville Street, VAST was the edge of the heights bounding the plain between the Scarpa and the Bethune-la-Basse-Lille Canal. Opposite the French 10th Army, the 14th Corps held the front with the 29th and 28th Divisions, and to the south, 1st Bavarian Reserve Corps held the line from Souchez to the south bank of the Scarpa at Arras, with the 5th and 1st Bavarian Reserve Divisions. After the British attack at Neuve-Chapelle, the local attacks which had occurred since December 1914 resumed, which resulted in minor changes of the front line. At the end of April, indications of a bigger attack in preparation and reports of new French units being formed suggested a more ambitious French attack north of Arras. French artillery fire began to increase in May, but the weather in Artois was mainly cloudy and overcast, which with French air superiority restricted German air reconnaissance and ground observation of the rear of the French 10th Army. Infantry patrolling was also inhibited, and the presence of the French 17th Corps was not detected until the 8th of May. An attack on the same day was made on the positions of the 28th Division west of L'Écoute-Vin by the French 43rd Division, which was eventually repulsed at great cost to both sides.